Why are you here? Marcus spoke to the chaplain for the first time that night. It was 3:47 a.m. The monitors beeped softly in the darkness, two silhouettes barely visible in the dim glow of medical equipment. The old chaplain didn't answer. He just looked. I'm asking you, Marcus coughed, his voice weak but angry. I kicked you out. I rejected your God. Every night, why do you keep coming? The chaplain was silent for a long moment. Then, for the first time in 3 weeks, he spoke. Because my son asked the same question. He died before I could answer. I'm going to answer you. Before we begin, make sure to subscribe to Soldier Stories so you never miss these true tales of courage. And tell us in the comments, where are you watching from today? Lieutenant Marcus Webb was 28 years old, dying of pancreatic cancer in Ward 7B of Walter Reed National Military Medical Center. 3 tours in Afghanistan, 2 Purple Hearts, 1 Silver Star, and a body that had finally decided to betray him in ways no enemy ever could. The cancer had been found too late, had spread too far, had wrapped itself around organs that couldn't be replaced or repaired. The doctors gave him weeks, maybe a month if he was lucky. Marcus didn't feel lucky. He hadn't felt lucky since Kandahar, since the day his convoy hit an IED and he watched his best friend burn alive while he couldn't move, couldn't help, couldn't do anything but scream. That was the day Marcus Webb stopped believing in God. If there was a God, he was either cruel or incompetent, and Marcus wanted nothing to do with either version. He had made his position clear from the moment he arrived at Walter Reed. No chaplains. No prayers. No religious visitors of any kind. He had taped a handwritten sign to his door, "No clergy allowed. This means you." The nurses smiled and walked past. The doctors ignored it. The other patients in the ward whispered about the angry atheist in 7B who was going to hell. Marcus didn't care. Hell couldn't be worse than what he had already seen. But Chaplain Thomas Brennan didn't read signs. Or perhaps he read them and chose to disobey. Father Brennan was 73 years old, a Catholic priest who had served as a military chaplain for 42 years. He had been in Vietnam, in Desert Storm, in the early days of Afghanistan. He had held dying men in jungles and deserts and mountains. He had whispered last rites into ears that could no longer hear, had closed eyes that would never open again, had written letters to families that would never recover. He was small, white-haired, with hands that trembled slightly from age and eyes that held depths of sorrow that most people couldn't fathom. He walked the halls of Walter Reed like a ghost, appearing at bedsides, offering comfort, listening to confessions that had nothing to do with religion and everything to do with being human. Everyone loved Father Brennan. Everyone except Marcus Webb. The first time the chaplain entered his room, Marcus had thrown a water pitcher at him. The second time he had screamed obscenities until the nurses came running. The third time he had simply turned his face to the wall and refused to acknowledge the old man's existence. Father Brennan had left each time without a word. No arguments, no attempts at conversion, no wounded pride. He simply nodded as if Marcus's rejection was expected and accepted and walked away. But he kept coming back. Not during visiting hours. Not when Marcus was awake and ready to fight. He came at night in the dead hours between 2 and 4 a.m., when the ward was quiet and the dying slept their restless sleep. He slipped through the door like a shadow, settled into the chair in the corner and sat. He didn't pray. He didn't read scripture. He didn't even close his eyes. He just sat, hands folded in his lap, watching Marcus breathe, waiting for something that only he seemed to understand. Nurse Martinez was the first to notice. She mentioned it to the night supervisor, who shrugged and said, "Father Brennan does what Father Brennan does. Leave him alone." But Martinez was curious. One night, she crept to Marcus's door and peered through the crack. What she saw made no sense. The chaplain sat motionless in the darkness. No Bible. No rosary. No whispered prayers. Just an old man keeping vigil over someone who hated everything he represented. Marcus discovered the visits by accident. He woke one night from a nightmare, the same nightmare, always the same, fire and screaming and the smell of burning flesh, and found he wasn't alone. Father Brennan sat in the corner, perfectly still, watching him with eyes that reflected the dim light of the monitors. "What the hell?" Marcus's voice cracked. "How long have you been there?" The chaplain didn't answer. He simply rose, nodded once and moved toward the door. "Wait." The word surprised Marcus as much as it surprised the priest. "I asked you a question. How long have you been sitting there?" Father Brennan paused at the door. "Long enough." "Long enough for what?" "Long enough to know you weren't going to die tonight." He left before Marcus could respond. The door clicked shut, and Marcus was alone with his monitors and his questions and the strange feeling that something had just shifted in the universe. He didn't sleep for the rest of the night. He lay in the darkness, staring at the chair where the chaplain had been sitting, trying to make sense of what had happened. The next night he pretended to sleep. At 2:17 a.m. the door opened. Father Brennan entered, silent as a whisper, and took his place in the corner. Marcus watched through barely open eyes as the old man settled in, folded his hands and began his vigil. No prayers. No movement. Just presence. Marcus lasted 40 minutes before he spoke. "I know you're not sleeping either." Father Brennan's lips curved slightly. Not quite a smile. "I haven't slept well in 30 years. Why?" "The same reason you don't. The faces." Marcus felt something crack in his chest. Not his body, that was already broken. Something else. A wall he had built long ago designed to keep everyone out. "You see faces?" "Every night. Young men. Boys really. Dying in my arms, asking questions I couldn't answer." The chaplain's voice was soft, distant. "After a while, you stop sleeping because the faces are waiting." They didn't become friends. Marcus wouldn't allow that. But they reached an understanding. Father Brennan came every night, and Marcus stopped pretending to be asleep. Sometimes they talked. Mostly they didn't. The silence between them became a kind of conversation, a shared language of men who had seen too much. Marcus learned that the chaplain had been in Vietnam with the 101st Airborne. That he had been at Hamburger Hill, at Khe Sanh, at places that existed now only in nightmares and history books. That he had earned a Bronze Star for carrying wounded men through enemy fire while refusing to pick up a weapon himself. "You could have died," Marcus said one night. "Running into fire without a gun. I could have died 1,000 times. So could you. We're still here. The question is why. There is no why. It's random. What? Nothing more." Father Brennan nodded slowly. "Maybe. Or maybe we're still here because we haven't finished what we're supposed to do." "And what am I supposed to do? Die in this bed? That's my big purpose." The chaplain was quiet for a long moment. "I don't know your purpose, Marcus. I barely know my own. But I know this, no one should die alone. That's not purpose. That's just human." Marcus turned away. The words hit too close to something he didn't want to examine. He had pushed everyone away, his family, his friends, the men from his unit who had tried to visit. He had built his isolation like a fortress, convinced that dying alone was better than making anyone watch him die. But here was this old man, uninvited, unwanted, sitting in the dark night after night, refusing to let him be alone. "Why me?" Marcus asked the ceiling. "There are other soldiers in this hospital. Believers. People who want you here. Why waste your time on someone who doesn't?" Father Brennan was silent for so long that Marcus thought he hadn't heard. "Then, because you remind me of someone." "Who?" "My son." The word hung in the air like smoke. "Son." Marcus turned his head, looking at the chaplain with new eyes. "You have a son?" "Had." The word was barely a whisper. "Michael. He died in Vietnam. February 14, 1970. Valentine's Day." Marcus didn't know what to say. In all his years of military service, all his training in leadership and tactics and survival, no one had ever taught him how to respond to a father's grief. "I'm sorry," he managed. He was 19. A medic like his old man wanted to be before I found the collar. He was shot helping a wounded Marine. Took 3 bullets to the chest. They said he died instantly, but I know that's a lie they tell families. Nobody dies instantly. There's always a moment, a breath, a thought. I've seen it too many times." Father Brennan's hands were trembling now, but his voice remained steady. "I wasn't there when he died. I was 2 miles away, giving last rites to a boy who had stepped on a mine. By the time I got to Michael, he was already cold. The Marines had covered him with a poncho. I had to lift it to see his face." Marcus felt tears burning his eyes. He hadn't cried since Kandahar. He had thought that part of him was dead. "Father. He was an atheist too, you know." The chaplain's voice cracked for the first time. "My own son. Raised in the church, altar boy until he was 13, and then he just stopped. Said he couldn't believe in a God who let innocent people suffer. We argued about it for years. I thought I could convince him, bring him back to the faith. I thought I had time." He wiped his eyes with the back of his hand. "The last thing he said to me was a question. The same question you asked tonight. Why are you here?" He meant something different. Why was I in Vietnam? Why did I choose this life? But the words were the same. I opened my mouth to answer, and the radio crackled. Another casualty. Another dying boy who needed me. I said I'll be right back and I ran. And I never came back. Not in time. Not ever. The room was silent except for the beeping monitors and the sound of two men breathing. I've spent 55 years trying to answer that question, Father Brennan said finally. Why am I here? Why did God take my son and leave me? What possible purpose could there be in a world this cruel? Marcus stared at him. Did you find an answer? No. But I found something else. A mission. A reason to keep going even without answers. What mission? The chaplain looked at him with eyes that held half a century of sorrow and something else. Something that looked almost like peace. No soldier dies alone. That's my mission. That's why I'm here night after night, in rooms where I'm not wanted, with men who don't believe in anything I believe in. Because my son died alone, calling for his father, and his father wasn't there. I can't change that. I can't go back. But I can make sure it doesn't happen to anyone else. Marcus felt the tears spilling down his cheeks now. He didn't try to stop them. How many? He asked. How many what? How many soldiers have you sat with? Like this. In the dark. Waiting. Father Brennan was quiet for a moment, calculating. 347. You're 348. 300. Marcus couldn't finish the sentence. 347 men. 347 nights in dark rooms, watching strangers breathe, refusing to let them face death alone. Most of them never knew I was there, the chaplain continued. Like you for the first few weeks. They slept through it or they were too far gone to notice. But I was there. Every single night until the end. Because that's what Michael would have wanted. That's the answer I finally found. Not why God took him, but what I could do with the time I had left. He leaned forward, his old eyes meeting Marcus's. You asked why I keep coming back. That's why. Not to convert you. Not to save your soul. Just to make sure you're not alone. That's all. That's everything. Something changed after that night. Marcus stopped fighting. Not fighting death. That battle was already lost. But fighting the presence of the old man who had appointed himself guardian of his final days. Father Brennan came every night and Marcus led him. Sometimes they talked about Vietnam, about Afghanistan, about the wars that had shaped them both. Sometimes they talked about nothing at all, sports, movies, the terrible hospital food. Sometimes they just sat in silence, two soldiers keeping watch over something neither of them could name. Marcus's condition worsened. The pain increased. The morphine doses grew larger. He slept more, talked less, felt himself slipping toward something vast and dark and unknown. But every night, when he opened his eyes at 3 a.m., the chaplain was there. A constant. A presence. A promise kept. One night, about a week before the end, Marcus asked the question he had been avoiding. Are you afraid of dying? Father Brennan considered this. I used to be. When I was young, when I thought death was the end of everything. But I've seen too many men die now. Good men, bad men, believers and atheists alike. And I've noticed something. What? At the very end, in that last moment, they all look the same. Peaceful. Like they've seen something the rest of us can't see. Like they've found an answer to a question they didn't know they were asking. Maybe that's just the brain shutting down. Chemicals. Neurons firing randomly. Maybe. The chaplain smiled. Or maybe there's something waiting on the other side. I don't know. I won't know until I get there. But I'm not afraid anymore. I've done what I was supposed to do. When my time comes, I'll be ready. What if there's nothing? What if it's just black? Then I won't know the difference, will I? Father Brennan reached out and took Marcus's hand, the first time he had touched him in all their nights together. But you won't be alone when you find out. That I can promise you. The last week was hard. Marcus drifted in and out of consciousness, the morphine blurring the line between dreams and reality. Sometimes he was back in Kandahar, surrounded by fire and screaming. Sometimes he was a child again, running through fields that existed only in memory. Sometimes he was nowhere at all, floating in a darkness that felt like a preview of what was coming. But every time he surfaced, every time he clawed his way back to consciousness, Father Brennan was there. The old man had stopped leaving. He had moved a cot into the corner of the room and stayed around the clock, reading, praying, waiting. The other nurses talked about it. The doctors shook their heads. The hospital administrator mentioned something about policy and visiting hours, but one look from Father Brennan silenced him. He's dying, the chaplain said quietly. Policy can wait. On the last night, Marcus woke with unusual clarity. The fog of medication lifted for a moment, and he saw the world with sharp, painful focus. The monitors. The tubes. The old man in the chair, rosary beads wrapped around his fingers, lips moving in silent prayer. Father. Brennan's eyes opened. He rose immediately, moving to the bedside. I'm here. I know. Marcus tried to smile. His face didn't quite cooperate. You're always here. Always. I want to ask you something. Anything. Marcus gathered his strength. He had been thinking about this for days, turning it over in his mind like a stone. Pray for me. Father Brennan's eyes filled with tears. Marcus, I don't know if I believe. I don't know if any of it's real. But you do. You've believed for 73 years through everything. And I think. He paused, breathing hard. I think I'd like to borrow your faith for a little while. Just until I find out for myself. The chaplain took his hand. His grip was warm, steady, alive. I've been praying for you every night since we met, he said. But I'll do it out loud now if you want. Please. Father Brennan prayed. Not the formal prayers of the church, not the Latin phrases and ancient rituals. He prayed like a father, like a soldier, like a man who had been talking to God for 70 years and still wasn't sure if anyone was listening. He prayed for Marcus's peace, for his pain to end, for his fear to dissolve into something like hope. He prayed for the friends Marcus had lost, for the family he had pushed away, for the young man who had gone to war full of faith and come home empty. And he prayed for Michael, for the son he had lost 55 years ago, for the question he had never been able to answer. Why are we here? He whispered, and he wasn't sure anymore if he was talking to God or to Marcus or to himself. I don't know. I've never known. But I know this, we're here together. And that has to mean something. It has to. Marcus listened with his eyes closed. The words washed over him like water, like light, like something he had forgotten he needed. When the prayer ended, he opened his eyes. Father Brennan was crying openly, tears streaming down his weathered face, but his voice was steady. Thank you, Marcus said. For what? For not letting me die alone. For sitting in this room night after night when I gave you every reason to leave. For answering the question. What question? Marcus smiled. A real smile this time, the first in months. Why are you here? You finally answered it. For Michael. For me. For every soldier who needs someone in the dark. That's why you're here. That's your purpose. Father Brennan bowed his head. And yours? I think mine was to teach you that it worked. All those years, all those soldiers. You weren't sure if it mattered, were you? If anyone noticed. If anyone cared. The chaplain couldn't speak. He just shook his head. It mattered, Marcus said. I noticed. I cared. And now I know I'm not alone. You gave me that. You gave Michael that through me. So thank you. Thank you for everything. Lieutenant Marcus Webb died at 4:17 a.m. on a Thursday morning. The monitors flatlined, the nurses rushed in, the doctors pronounced what everyone already knew. But Father Brennan didn't leave. He stayed beside the bed, holding the hand that had grown cold, finishing the prayer he had started. Only when the orderlies came to take the body did he finally let go. He walked out of the room and down the corridor, past the nurse's station, past the other patients, past the world that kept spinning despite the hole that had just been torn in it. He walked to the chapel at the end of the hall, entered and knelt before the altar. For the first time in 55 years, Father Thomas Brennan wept for his son. Really wept, with the kind of grief he had been holding back since Vietnam, the kind of sorrow that had been frozen inside him like a winter that never ended. But these weren't tears of despair. They were tears of release, of completion, of something that felt almost like joy. Marcus had been right. Mattered. All of it, every night, every vigil, every soldier he had sat with in the dark. It had mattered. Not because it changed the outcome, not because it made death any less final, but because no one had died alone. Because in the worst moment of their lives, someone had been there. Someone had cared. That was enough. That was everything. A month later, at Marcus Webb's memorial service, Father Brennan delivered the eulogy. The church was full. The family Marcus had pushed away had come anyway, along with his unit, his doctors, the nurses who had watched his final weeks. Marcus didn't believe in God, the chaplain said from the pulpit. He told me that every chance he got. But he believed in something harder. He believed in the choice to be present. To stay when it's easier to leave. To love when there's nothing to gain. He paused, looking out at the faces before him. In the end, that might be the only faith that matters. The faith that says, I'm here. I see you. You're not alone. He stepped down from the pulpit and saluted the flag-draped coffin. 348 soldiers. 348 nights in the dark. And now, finally, an answer to the question that had haunted him since 1970. Why are you here? To make sure no one dies alone. That was the mission. That was the meaning. That was the answer. Father Thomas Brennan continued his work at Walter Reed for another 7 years, sitting with dying soldiers, holding hands, keeping watch. When he finally died at age 80, the hospital chapel was standing room only. Generals and privates, believers and atheists, doctors and nurses, they all came to honor the priest who had understood something that most people never learn. The greatest act of faith isn't believing in God, it's believing in each other. Moral of the story: presence is the purest form of love. Sometimes the answer to why are you here is simply because you need someone to be. If this story moved you, don't forget to show your support. Please subscribe for more soldier stories. We bring you true tales of courage, sacrifice, and honor, stories that remind us of the quiet strength carried by those who serve. Until next time, stay safe, stay strong, and never forget the heroes among us.